Good morning. My name is Good morning. My name is Lara Rios. I'm a project finance partner and co-leader of the ESG practice at Holland & Knight, a law firm based here in Miami. Thank you for joining us this morning. I also want to thank the World Strategic Forum for the opportunity to moderate what I hope is a lively conversation with this esteemed panel we've put together about one of the most pressing and exciting challenges of our time, transforming infrastructure for supply chain resilience and environmental sustainability. As the world continues to evolve, we are confronted with increasing and unprecedented disruptions from climate change, political risks, health crises, and natural disasters, to supply chain bottlenecks and shifting global trade dynamics. But at the same time, there is an urgency to reduce our environmental footprint, and that has never been more pronounced. In this context, infrastructure plays a very vital role. It is the backbone that supports global trade, connects economies, and enables the flow of goods and services, all while facing growing pressures to adapt to an increasingly unpredictable world. So our discussion today will delve into how we can transform infrastructure systems to meet these dual challenges of resiliency and stability. The transformation requires not only innovation, but collaboration across the types of industries we'll talk about today, various sectors, and of course, various stakeholders, including those of you in the audience. All with the goal, as the mayor discussed, to have a future-proof infrastructure that can withstand both the physical and operational shocks that are just around the corner. So today, I'm very proud to welcome this exceptional panel, each representing different perspectives across the infrastructure landscape. I'll introduce them briefly, and then we'll just jump right in. So immediately to my left, we have Audrey Robat, the Chief Financial Officer of Engie North America. Laurent, Germain, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Egis, the global engineering and operating firm. David Anderton, who is the Assistant Port Director for Port Everglades, one of the nation's leading container ports and South Florida's main seaport. And Ralph Cutié, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Miami-Dade Airport. He also oversees 4 other general aviation airports in South Florida. So with that, I'm going to ask our panelists to talk a little bit more about their organizations and their role, but through the lens of the topic for today. And to kick things off, I'd like them to talk about how they define and consider resiliency in their respective organizations. Audrey.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everybody. So Engie is a global company headquartered in France, but really with an international footprint. Just to give a few figures, we generate roughly like 80 billion euros of revenues, 10 billion of operating income, and we reinvest approximately the same amount in terms of capex each year. We are present in 30 countries in Europe, obviously, but the US is a large area of focus of growth, Latin America as well, South Africa, India, and Middle East. So we are an integrated utility company, and I think this is the equity story, or really about our resilience path. We are present across the whole value chain, which means generation, transmission, distribution, and supply of both gas and power. And we develop our power portfolio very significantly over the past 15 years in hydro, wind, onshore, offshore, solar, and more recently with battery storage and the upgrade of the power networks. So having this ability to operate and integrate the whole value chain of energy, to leverage existing infrastructure and to have a balance within our portfolio and the portfolio of the countries we operate is really how we consider we are able to promote and deploy and provide affordable, resilient, and grid energy to our customer.
Thank you. Laurent?
Thank you. Very happy to be here this morning. I think we're all in the middle of a big paradox. The paradox is the following. The world population will increase by 2 billion people by 2050. We will need more infrastructure, more buildings for them. Infrastructure and buildings are responsible for 50% of the greenhouse emissions. So building more infrastructure, more buildings will lead to an increase of the greenhouse emissions. At the same time, all the governments, all, I would say, the private companies, the municipalities are taking commitments in order to reduce the greenhouse emissions. How do we reconcile, two trends which seems in contradiction? Only the engineers can find, I would say, the technical solutions in order to conceive and construct and then exploit the infrastructures in a more sustainable way. And this is exactly what companies like Egis, so Egis is the French leader for engineering, for infrastructure. So the 20,000 staff of Egis are designing the infrastructure in a much more sustainable way than they did 10 or 20 years ago. And this is precisely what will allow us collectively to have a world with more sustainable and resilient infrastructure. So in terms of objectives, there is objective, of course, that the infrastructure will be less emissive, so fewer carbon emissions. Second objective is biodiversity, preservation of biodiversity. Third objective is resilience, because, of course, the climate change will have a big economic impact, but also physical impact on the existing infrastructure.
Thank you. David, maybe you can speak a little bit about how the port defines resiliency and how you think about it in your operations.
Sure. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. Very happy to be here. If you don't know a little bit about Port Everglades, it's actually right up the street, about 30 miles north of here, in really the city of Fort Lauderdale, Hollywood, and Dania Beach. It lies within 3 municipalities. We are a critical spoke in the hub of the supply chain. And for us, from a resiliency standpoint, that's very important, taking into account the type of infrastructure that we have and how we improve that infrastructure to be resilient, to be able to sustain and be able to react and reopen in the face of challenges and emergencies. And we see a lot of that these days with regards to climate change. So a lot of our focus in terms of replacing infrastructure has been on not just replacing it as it was, but replacing it in a way that will allow for the port to remain open and be able to sustain itself in the face of really climate change. And in South Florida in particular, that is very important when it comes to obviously storm events. And in addition to that, we also have seen the frequency of 100-year flood events actually occur regularly. And I'll talk a little bit about that and some of the things that we've done from an infrastructure standpoint, working with our partners to ensure the ability of the port to maintain the flow of goods, not only from a container standpoint, but also from an energy standpoint. Port Everglades provides petroleum products to 12 counties in South Florida and actually all 3 international airports, Palm Beach, Miami-Dade via pipeline, and also Fort Lauderdale via pipeline. So I look forward to talking a little bit in more detail about some of the things that we're doing from an infrastructure standpoint and also from an operational standpoint as we move forward in the conversation.
Thank you. Ralph.
Sure. Thank you, Laura. And special thank you to Bill Johnson for inviting me again. This is the 3rd year doing it, Bill. You know, I really enjoy this forum because it gives me the opportunity to highlight a lot of the good work that we're doing at Miami International Airport under the mayor's leadership. So just kind of to start out, MIA for short is the county's #1 economic engine and probably the state's #1 economic engine. So we represent, to give you an idea of the importance, we represent approximately $118 billion of business revenue and more than 700,000 jobs annually statewide. That's direct, indirect, related, and induced. So that's the kind of impact that we have. Currently, we are well on our way towards our 3rd straight consecutive record-breaking year in passenger volume. As a matter of fact, I will let the news out that I just found out about 5 minutes ago. As per our daily report yesterday, we exceeded last year's record-breaking number of 52.3 million passengers. So with 20 days left in the year, we are now well on our way to our projected passenger number of nearly 56 million passengers this year. So that's a great number, 3 straight years. We're also well on our way towards our 5th straight year of record-breaking cargo volume. So we expect to reach nearly 3 million tons of cargo by the end of this year. So it's a really exciting time right now. As far as resilience and sustainability are concerned, you know, MIA has a very long and proud history of being in sustainability and resilience and taking the forefront in that. And you mentioned Lara, the mayor's Future Ready initiative, and she is, with her unwavering support, we are continuing that tradition at MIA, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into some of our infrastructure projects and our capital program. But essentially, it's in our culture. Sustainability and resilience is built into every single project that we have. Our capital program, which we'll talk about later, consists of 150 projects. It's a $9 billion program, the biggest investment ever made in the almost 98-year history of our airport. And it's something we're very excited about. And it will include the latest and greatest resilience and sustainability components. And we have projects underway already that include them. And I can talk about that a little bit. But again, long-standing history that we're very proud of, collaborations with FPL services and our utilities on different energy conservation initiatives. And those will continue in the future. And obviously, based on what everybody else said, I mean, it's an important thing. I mean, climate change is not going to go away. And issues of flooding and other issues, weather, et cetera, which we obviously deal with all the time, is something that, you know, we have a keen eye on. So we're looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. In discussing and defining resiliency and sustainability, indirectly, we're defining and identifying the vulnerabilities, right? Resiliency is a response to identified risk or perceived risk and vulnerabilities. I think when we've looked back over the last 10 years, the risks are not new. There's always been warfare. There's always been trade warfare. There have always been weather-related events, public health crisis, you know, not as significant as COVID, surely, at least here in North America. But these problems have always existed. I think what has changed, and some of us have already spoken to this, is the frequency in which these events and these disruptions are occurring. So I'm curious, as executives in your roles, who are tasked with, you know, future planning, how do you respond to such a quickly evolving landscape? The pace of the disruption has to be a challenge. Laurent, I'm curious as to what your clients are seeing and what advice you give them.
So, I mean, a few facts. 2023 was the warmest year in the warmest decade ever on the planet. There were 97 natural disasters between 1984 and 2003 that cost more than $1 billion, but there were 273 between 2004 and 2023. So the question is not, you know, having disasters. We've always had disasters, but it's the recurrence, you know, of these disasters coming. That's why, you know, the cost of adaptation, the cost to adapt to these new conditions will rise from $300 billion an annum by 2030 to $500 billion an annum by 2050. So how do we deal with this as engineers? Well, first of all, in order to, we need to tackle the existing infrastructure. So what we're saying to our clients is that we need to assess, I would say, the resilience of the infrastructure and build a plan according to the data, not the data of the past, but incorporating, I would say, in all the calculations about the infrastructure, the data of the future. what we anticipate in terms of, floodings, heat, and so on, in order to have a plan to update and renovate the existing infrastructure, especially in the areas which are, more vulnerable, like, the area of Miami, for instance, where we've seen, the cost of, all these disasters. So this is for the existing infrastructure. And then there is the issue of the next infrastructure. And this is what we are doing through the eco-design, I would say, methodology, where our engineers, again, are taking into account the meteorological data of, the next 50 years with stress tests to take some technical decisions that will allow the infrastructure to be more resilient than it were.
Audrey, I know that at your company, power generation is obviously a crucial piece of infrastructure for so many others in the supply chain. And weather-related events, especially here in North America, have taken an increased and more frequent toll on your existing infrastructure. How is Engie as an organization responding to those new challenges and the increased frequency of those challenges from a capital perspective and a planning perspective?
Yeah, I think there is a twofold or two kind of answer to this question. First, I think that for the past 5 years, 6 years, we have been incorporating in all our investment decision an assessment of how the climate change can impact weather forecast. We are building asset for 30, 35 years. So the rain regime, the irradiation, what can we project for the first piece of the project, let's say the first 20 years, but what are the scenarios that we can think about how the weather can be disrupted afterwards, and how it can impact the profitability, expected profitability of those projects, but how we can also imagine design that can cope with such kind of change. Then the location is much more and more important in our decision making process, and the exposure of location to hail, storm, flooding, and on top of engineers we work with, our insurers are very helpful partners. That's also a no-brainer. We have to check if some location can be, or some plans in specific location can be insured going forward. And so really we spend a lot of time working with our insurance teams for the development projects, but also on our existing portfolio to see how we can be on a continuous improvement path to protect our asset and build them where the risk can be easily mitigated. And maybe the second part of my answer, if I may, that if we want to accelerate the deployment of renewable as one of the answer to the fight against climate change, considering the increase in consumption, the increase of the electrification, we need more power infrastructure, power transmission line, and battery storage to accommodate the intermittency of wind and solar, and also the imbalance between the location of the assets and the location of the consumption. So that's really where we are spending a lot of time working with not only federal executive, but state, regional grid operator to be able to get some clarity, roadmap, planning on the expected transmission line that are needed to transport this green energy.
Laurent, it looked like you wanted to jump in real quick there.
No, just highlighting yet that the infrastructure and buildings will need to be more resilient, of course, because of climate change, but also because of another challenge, which is urbanization. I don't know if you know, but in 2100, the most populated cities in the world will be in Africa, and they will have 70 million of people working inside them. today, the most populated cities like Tokyo, I mean, they're around 25 million. So can you imagine how resilient the infrastructure will need to be in order to sustain cities with so many people living in them? So it's going to be Lagos, it's going to be Kinshasa, and these cities are also already now vulnerable as they are coastal cities.
David, here in South Florida, it used to be exceptional if there was an extreme weather event. Now, just even this last October, we suffered in the state a number of back-to-back weather crises. So I'm curious, both from David and Ralph's perspective, how is our port infrastructure responding to what seems like an onslaught, not just of weather-related events, but also if you could speak to, from a different perspective of resiliency against security risks? Because I was reading in the New York Times today that the Houthis in the Gulf are creating havoc with respect to our supply chain, resulting in shipping companies needing to circumvent the south of, the Horn of Africa to reach Europe, which is what they used to do in the 1800s. So our port infrastructure has a number of risks. They're constantly evolving. And again, the pace at which you have to respond seems increased.
Yeah, great two-part question there. So I'm gonna take the first piece, infrastructure. So Port Everglades is a department of Broward County. We're fortunate because Broward County has been a leader from a resiliency standpoint for many years. So this is not something that has just started to be looked at from the county and from the port standpoint. Our resilient environment department at the county has a chief resilience officer who started a climate pact, a tri-county climate pact here in South Florida that includes Palm Beach County, Broward, and Miami-Dade County. And from that pact, there have been numerous vulnerability assessments that have been completed by the county that include the port area. And the port is actually taken a little bit of a deeper dive based on that analysis and conducted its own vulnerability assessment to look at really what type of infrastructure projects need to take place to be able to adapt to climate change. So the first project that comes to mind, and it's actually underway right now, is we have a very aggressive plan to replace our aging bulkheads at Port Everglades. So really the seawalls, if you will. The seawalls are original to the port. Some of them were built back in the 1930s. So currently we have a project underway at about $150 million where we're replacing those seawalls. And we're not replacing them the same way they were built. We're replacing them in a way where they're adaptable to sea level rise. So the engineers have designed those seawalls in a way that the cap wall, so in essence, a seawall is really sheet pile structure that's driven down, and then it's capped with concrete. They've been designed in a way that we'll be able to raise that cap wall in 2-foot increments as sea level rises. So that's about a $150 million project that's underway right now. We anticipate that the first 4 bursts will be completed in about 1.5 years. And one of the other important things to talk about here is the additional cost for these types of infrastructure projects when you're talking about resiliency and making things resilient from a climate change standpoint. It adds a significant amount of cost. It needs to be done. So we've also been very fortunate to be able to leverage both federal and state funding to help us pay for these projects. So for example, the project I was just speaking about, we actually received $32 million from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, Florida Resiliency Grant Program, to help fund this project. And I'll give some other examples as we move along. Now, to take the second part of your question from a security standpoint, it's a shame what's going on. And it's a shame to everybody in the audience, the end user, because what that does is that adds cost to all of your products. So the port is actively working with its local law enforcement, with federal government, to look at ways that we can continue to improve our security. And one thing we're actually getting ready to start now is a collaborative project with the Florida Department of Transportation is going to look at placing certain, I'm not going to get too specific, but certain devices as a pilot project on our cranes that will be able to detect potential issues with containers before they're actually offloaded onto the mules to move to the yard. So that's something that we're actively working with the Florida Department of Transportation right now. And as we move along, I'll talk a little bit about some other collaborative efforts that we're having with other state and federal agencies as well.
Thank you. Ralph.
Sure. So interesting you mentioned that. When it comes to infrastructure, resilience, and sustainability, I think there's 4 critical things as an organization, as a department, as a county that are important. And that's in no particular order: culture, commitment, execution, and enforcement. And like I said before, we have a long history at Miami International Airport built into our DNA of incorporating sustainability and resilience into our projects. But concrete examples is the best way to prove it, right? So about a year and a half ago, if you recall, we had a really bad rain event, and David was aware of it because I know we felt their pain. Fort Lauderdale Airport and Port Everglades had some flooding, etc. So we were very, very fortunate that we had negligible flooding at MIA. And the reason for that is what I mentioned before: the commitment and the culture we had over the last 25 to 30 years. Our civil engineering team has put together a very, very robust and comprehensive stormwater drainage master plan for our airport. And that master plan has been executed and enforced over the last 25, 30 years. And now, as you said, climate change and weather events, which weren't as common before, now they become almost yearly things, or they happen multiple times a year. So we were ready for those events. And when we had those rain events, our stormwater drainage system came through, and we were able to remain operational. And at the end of the day, for an airport as for a seaport, the most important thing is operational viability, safety, and readiness. And we were able to maintain that because of the plan that we executed over the last 25, 30 years. So that's a concrete example of how not only by planning and being proactive and enforcement, you can address climate change and these type of weather events, but also just continuing that execution and planning for the future. And then in some of our future projects that we're currently engaged in, for our capital program and our modernization program, I'll give you some examples. As far as, like Laurent mentioned, carbon emissions, another big deal. We're currently in the process of replacing all of our passenger loading bridges at the airport. It's about 128 of them. We've already replaced 32 of them. Each and every bridge will include brand new 400 hertz electrical systems, which is the equivalent of shore power at a seaport, where an aircraft will dock at our gate and they'll draw power from the terminal, not have to run their auxiliary power unit, their APU on the aircraft, thereby reducing carbon emissions, reducing electrical consumption, and also obviously making us more resilient, et cetera. So that project is underway. We've already replaced 30 some odd bridges. And again, sustainability and resilience baked right into the project. We have a 430,000 square foot roof replacement project, which is in the final stages of design. That project will include a significant, it's a $130 million project plus or minus. It will include a significant number of solar panels on our roof, which is a challenge because of all the MEP we have on our roof. But the mayor made it a priority, and we're making it happen. So with those solar panels on that area of our roof, along with some other areas that we're exploring, we may end up generating several, I'm not an electrical engineer, but several kilowatts of power. It'll make us one of the biggest power generators in the state, being an airport, not even a power company. So those are exciting things that we're looking at in order to make us more resilient. And like I said, every single one of our projects, our current parking garage, amusingly enough, it's a $137 million project. It's going to add another 2,200 parking spaces to our facility. But really, as important, it's going to include 50 electrical vehicle charging stations. It's going to include it does include the latest LED lighting technology, the latest sea level rise components built into the project. So again, it starts out at the very top with our mayor. It's a priority for her. It's been a priority for us for many years. She continues to support that priority. And every single one of our projects includes those types of things. Lastly, we just recently, 4 years ago, finished a energy conservation program with FPL Services, our local utility. And with that program, we replaced throughout our terminals, electrical systems, HVAC systems, water systems. That program guarantees that we'll save approximately $60 million or more than $60 million over the next 15-year repayment period for that program. So we have brand new net zero equipment, which is a lot less, it consumes a lot less energy. We save a guaranteed savings of $60+ million a year, plus a reduction in carbon emissions and an initiative that makes our airport more resilient and more sustainable. So those are some of the things, and I mean, we could be here for hours and I can talk about other ones because it's something that is just part of our DNA.
Just to follow up a little bit on that rain event and I guess the connection between us and Miami International Airport from a fuel perspective. Our infrastructure at the port, you know, the main drainage infrastructure on the roadway networks actually perform very well. Right. Our private partners on the energy sector, you know, we have a lot of obviously fuel tank yards at the port that I said provide all of this energy to different sectors. They had some issues, and when you're talking about that amount of rain in such a short period of time, these facilities are bermed in to prevent environmental, you know, problems if something happens to one of these tanks. And what happened in this case is that those bermed in areas filled up very quickly with water, created an inability to get rid of that water. And what happened was that the pumping systems were at a low elevation, and a lot of those pumping systems failed, which created a serious issue in terms of being able to get not only fuel to the airports, but also fuel to the private gas stations that fuel the personal occupancy vehicles here in South Florida. So we've been working with, again, our state partners and with our private sector energy partners, and what they've done and are continuing to do is actually elevate those pumping structures for future events so there won't be that same type of situation. So I just wanted to follow up with the opportunity that he gave me related to that particular event.
And by the way, we're extremely happy about that because we get all our fuel from Port Everglades. So great thing for us.
We were receiving phone calls very quickly after that rain event.
We were worried.
I think what everyone's highlighting here is that the investment in resilient infrastructure is critical. It is paramount for many organizations, and ultimately for within the supply chain life cycle, it's critical at every point within that life cycle. Which begs the question, and David touched on this a little bit, I'm curious what the panelists have to think, begs the question, how do we finance the improvements that are required and at the scale that Laurent mentioned to respond to these challenges? I know the Biden administration has made it a hallmark of their administration to nearshore domestic manufacturing, to further strengthen the domestic supply chain with respect to certain industries, and has unlocked a lot of federal financing, both in grants and low interest loans, to facilitate that. I'm curious, in your respective industries and what you're seeing across a number of industries, Laurent, where is the financing available? Where does it come from? And what structures, public, private partnerships, private capital, do you think are the most responsive to these challenges? I don't know who wants to kick things off.
Well, first of all, again, you know, the scale of what is needed to be achieved. The annual investment for sustainable infrastructure is currently at $2 trillion. It needs to be $3 trillion if we have any chance to reach the Paris Agreement. So we need to find an additional, trillion dollars per year in terms of investing in resilience and sustainable infrastructure. Governments, of course, must contribute, and I think they become more and more aware that they need to redeploy part of their budget into, I would say, doing more investments on their infrastructure, brownfield, of course, and greenfield. So increasing government spending is absolutely necessary, especially in the developed countries. Then, of course, there need to be more involvement of the private sector. For the private sector to put more money on the table, there should be, of course, a balance of risks. And so, yes, concessions, PPPs are good models when the private sector have, I would say, long-term commitments, when they can project themselves, I would say, in a long run, in order to secure the investments that they will do in order to consolidate, I would say, the infrastructure. So, yes, P3 will come back. I hope, strongly, and concessions of infrastructure, operations and maintenance of the infrastructure given to the private sector. I think this will contribute to reduce the gap that we're currently seeing.
And coming back to what you were mentioning about the implementation of the IRA and maybe just slightly before the CHIPS Act, I mean, for the energy industry, it has been very effective first because there were subsidies in place for a while, maybe more than 20 years, but having this visibility for the next 10 years was really reassuring as an investor to be able to take some higher development risk to develop our pipeline. And in 2022, this IRA also enlarged significantly the way we can tap this market, not only through quite complex tax equity structure that requires a lot of sophistication, and I would like to pay tribute to my team because that's quite a challenge it was quite a challenge to implement. But moving to a more tax transfer, which has been much more easier to implement, and which really enlarged significantly the pool of money that we can tap, not only from banks, but also from corporate buyers. And on the supply chain piece, we have seen over the past years this reshoring of manufacturing. Solar panels, for instance, we have local suppliers, foreign companies building factories in the US to be able to qualify as a domestic content. So for wind and solar, that has been very effective, a very effective strategy. And Laurent might maybe concur that I think this is something Europe should get inspired about. What is still remains a challenge is about battery storage. I was mentioning a few minutes ago. I mean, we are still, or this industry, those suppliers are still very dependent of the Chinese supply chain or Chinese equipment, including Tesla, which might sound surprising. So if we think about how tariff might evolve, that might be a challenge for the industry. I think I'm optimistic about how the US industry can adjust to this new environment and be able to develop this supply chain locally, including up to the mining to find suitable minerals. In a short period of time, but we still might speak about 2 or 3 years.
David, you mentioned your collaboration and partnership with the federal government. How crucial has it been to unlock federal dollars to improve infrastructure at the port?
It's been very, very important. We've been very fortunate at Port Everglades over the last 3 or 4 years to take advantage of a lot of this federal funding, where in the past the port typically had not received federal funding for capital infrastructure projects. Our projects were implemented with the revenue that the port made, and then also with the help from the Florida Department of Transportation, which has several programs that help support port infrastructure. So with the Biden administration and their focus on specifically port infrastructure, we've been able to take advantage of a lot of funding from the federal government through specifically the Port Infrastructure Development Program through MARAD and the U.S. Department of Transportation. Another one of our bulkhead projects has received $19.5 million, separate from the one that I discussed earlier through the PID program. And this recently, we were actually just awarded the second largest amount in FY24 through PIDP in a collaborative effort with 2 of our private terminal operators focused on reducing emissions at the port, trying to get to that net zero sort of emissions, if you will, from a seaport perspective. And that award was $52.5 million. And what we'll be doing with that is the 2 terminal operators will be purchasing a significant amount of yard equipment that is electric, EV equipment, and hybrid equipment, and then also upgrades to some of the electrical units within the yards to allow for charging and things of that nature. So we've been very fortunate to be able to take advantage of the federal funding, and that project that I just mentioned is somewhat unique in that partnering with two of our terminal operators, so they're able to upgrade their equipment to reduce emissions at the port.
Ralph, can you speak to kind of the financing challenges and kind of I know in your role, collaboration with various stakeholders is critical to unlocking and being successful at transforming your infrastructure. So maybe speak to that collaboration as well.
Thank you, Lara. So to piggyback on what David said, I mean, we have been very, very fortunate at MIA to enjoy an extremely just a great relationship with our federal partners, with the FAA and with the state of Florida. So our planning and grants division, who is very experienced, does a very good job doing that. I give them all the credit. Over the last 5 years, I think we've been able to obtain more than $740 million in federal and state grants, about 90% of it federal, 10% state. So you know, we go after every single grant opportunity under the Biden administration. We've received a significant amount of BIL dollars, also airport improvement program dollars and terminal expansion dollars from the federal government. So those partnerships and those collaborations are critical to us because we are what's considered in the industry, for those that are not familiar with the term, we're considered a residual airport. So what does that mean? We self-generate all of our own revenue. So we don't receive 1 cent from the county's tax rolls. We don't get any money from property taxes. So all of our infrastructure projects and all of our operations are funded through the money that we generate and grants that we get from our federal and state partners. So typically, how that breaks down is about 35% of our revenue is what we call non-aeronautical revenue. And that is just revenue that we generate from rents and charges that we make to our concessions, those kind of things. The remaining 65% of our revenue, which is the quote unquote residual, we generate that from the landing fees that we charge our airlines, passenger facility charges, et cetera, et cetera. And then we make up the difference by the federal and state grants that I mentioned. So typically what we'll do is we'll sell tax-exempt revenue bonds, which we pay off over a period of time. And that is based on our bond ratings, which are excellent. Over the last couple of years, all of our bond ratings have increased after COVID. We've had a great rebound. They're all AA plus, depending on what rating agency you listen to. So we've had a really good track record, and a lot of that is based on what you mentioned, Lara, was just the relationships and the collaboration. We are in constant contact with our federal partners, with all of the state partners as well. We just received a couple of months ago $60 million worth of state funding, $30 million to fund one of our terminal expansions, and another $30 million to fund some of our ticket counter and infrastructure improvements in one of our older terminals. So we continue to go after those dollars. We couldn't really perform or implement some of the projects that we do without those dollars. So it's something that really, really is critical to us. And to echo David's point, we continue to go after that. And it's all about relationships.
So speaking of relationships, I want to talk a little bit about the involvement of government and regulation. And I think there's a tension. You have, an increased amount of pressure from all stakeholders, but in particular from governments to achieve certain climate targets. And all of that is pushed down. And I think across the board, the ESG conversation has certainly exploded in recent years. And I think for the most part, people are responsive to their stakeholders' desires to see increased resilience and sustainability. But how does one implement, especially when we're talking about large projects, large capital projects, how does one actually execute those projects when also having to navigate on the ground a very complicated bureaucratic regulatory environment, whether it's permitting or otherwise? And so I'm curious from Laurent and Audrey's perspective, how do you envision the role of government regulation evolving to support the infrastructure transformation that the supply chain needs, looking towards the future?
Yes, it is turning very, very local. I mean, over notably the relationship with the ISO, the grid operator, is of the utmost importance to develop our project. I mean, we are talking about their transmission planning, interconnection queue, support into permitting, but also stakeholder management when it is needed. So we tend to be, and especially after or right before the IRA implementation, very much focused on the relationship at federal level to unlock this possibility. But we are now redeveloping our teams, our GNRA team, to be more to work closely with all those local stakeholders to be able to accelerate. And that's right. That's true. That over the past year, the pipeline of renewable developers has been pushed by 1, 2, 3 years because of the interconnection queue. There is a huge demand for load growth, huge demand from developers to be able to access new transmission capacities. But the institution, the administration, are not sized yet to be able to cope with this volume of activities. And from time to time, they still need to understand when we come, especially with a battery project, what is at stake, how it will impact their own way to operate their network. So we need to collaborate very, very closely to build this plan to be able to develop more effectively and be able to commission those projects earlier on.
I think regulation can have a great impact on innovation. So in France, regulation has been introduced for office buildings and targets to be met for greenfield projects of office buildings. This led to a lot of innovation on net zero carbon buildings that are being built right now in all the cities of France. So regulation can have a very positive impact on innovation, but regulation has to be relevant and flexible. If we take another regulation taken this time at the European Union level, which is not producing thermal cars in 2035, this now leads the automotive industry in Europe to be totally not performing. Why? Because the consumers are not following the trend that the regulator wanted. And you've seen, that Stellantis is in a very difficult situation, and the automotive OEM, they're all saying, we will not meet this target, because if we want to meet this target, then it's going to be the end of the European, automotive industry. That's why, when the regulation is not meeting its objectives, we should, of course, cancel it or be flexible and adjust it. So, yes, regulation can have a positive impact on innovation. Be careful to really assess very regularly that we are on the good trend towards the objective the regulation was supposed to achieve.
I don't know if David or Ralph, you deal in such a highly regulated space. How do you navigate those relationships, and do you view the regulation as limiting in any way or challenging in any way?
So from the port perspective, and I see Bill in the audience, former port director, he knows. There's a lot of strings that come along with these federal awards, federal grant dollars that we've been receiving, and many ports and other entities have been receiving. And probably the most difficult regulation is NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, enacted back in the early 70s. A 5-page document that it was meant to do great things, but I think it's become very burdensome. And from a standpoint of adding time to implementation of a project, being able to comply with NEPA, anytime you accept these federal dollars, federal program, you need to be NEPA compliant. So what we're seeing is that's adding a significant amount of time to project implementation, which then it adds a significant amount of dollars to project cost, because we all know inflation has been rampant over the last 4, 5, 6 years. Construction costs have gone through the roof, and with that type of bureaucratic system, it's just going to continue to add time to implementation and then cost to your project. So I think that's something that really needs to be looked at. I know the former Trump administration made some modifications to NEPA. I know the Biden administration made some modifications to NEPA, but it's still a very overburdensome process. And that is something that if we want to implement projects in the most efficient, cost and time way, we need to be able to speed that process up because it just takes too long.
I know we're running short on time, so why don't I just throw out the last question, and Ralph, you could take it. For our audience who might be wondering, what advice would you give to those in the audience to bring back to their respective organizations with respect to looking to how to more effectively transform their infrastructure for greater resiliency and sustainability? What should we be thinking about?
I think, to put it simply, the most important thing is what I mentioned before. You have to have a commitment from the top, from leadership. You mentioned, we'll touch a little bit on regulation. I mean, we were a county department, just like Port Everglades. The county has a sustainability ordinance, which we're required to comply with. If you know that, then you have to prepare for it. You need to make sure that all your consultants, all your contractors are aware of this and informed, so that you don't come back later. As to David's point, sometimes, regulations are good, but sometimes they can make the entire project implementation process drag on. So what I would say is, you need to make sure that your organizations are committed to this, because it's a problem. Climate change exists, carbon issues exist. So we need to make sure that your organizations have that commitment and buy-in from the top down, and we get it on our end, from the mayor's end all the way down to myself, my boss, Chief Morales, all of our staff. They're very well aware of where the commitment lies, why it's important, and we've been doing it for a long time. And I think that is the one takeaway: is you need to make sure that your individual teams understand, and that leadership understands that commitment has to be there in order to make these projects happen.
Clients usually pay for Laurent's advice, so maybe you'll give us some free advice.
No, we talked a lot about financing and how, the financing gap for infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure, needs to be closed. But there is another gap, which is the gap of expertise. We don't have enough, I would say, skilled people, trained and educated in terms of sustainable infrastructure. So there is a big challenge, for the education systems everywhere in the world to train and graduate more people becoming experts in terms of sustainable infrastructure. This is a huge challenge. Money will be, of course, necessary, but having the minds in order to conceive and then construct and exploit infrastructure in a more sustainable way is also a very stringent challenge.
Audrey?
Yeah, maybe first, and Ralph mentioned it earlier on, I think energy efficiency, energy saving is also the first way to be able to release a bit of the tension on the infrastructure and to limit capex, limit investment. So I think that's a very first step in all resilience paths, how we can reduce our consumption to be less exposed. And then my second advice would be about agility that was already mentioned. The energy I've been in the energy sector for 20 years. It has changed many times at a very accelerated pace. We see today the resurgence of nuclear as well, which would have been probably very hard to imagine even in Europe some years ago. So having some kind of infrastructure that leverage local energies, but doesn't prevent any other option that can come in the future.
David, I'll give you the last word.
So not to harp on NEPA, but I've got a little deepening and widening project. This is just to give you an example that I've been trying to get done at the port for the last 23 years that I've been working there. This project has been going on through the environmental process with the federal government for 28 years. Think about that. This project began in the 90s, was authorized by Congress to move to construction in 2015 at a cost of about $350 million. Today, we're still running through the NEPA process, And my latest cost estimate for the project is about $1.25 billion. So that tells you something right there about, you know, what I was talking about earlier, getting a project to implementation in an efficient way that retains and does not allow for increase in cost. And we're still not there yet. We're getting closer, but we still got a bit of a ways to go with the environmental agencies.
I believe we're at time. I want to thank the panelists for their very interesting perspectives on this very complicated topic, and for the audience, your attendance today. Thank you very much.